this video, we're going to do a power jack repair on a Toshiba laptop. Now what's wrong with this computer is the tip on the inside of the power jack is loose. So I'm going to open it up and see if I see anything on the jack itself or inside the jack that would show what's happening in there and get it fixed up. First thing I like to do is get a piece of foam so when I turn the computer over, it doesn't scratch the surface of the computer. And then second thing, actually, you take the battery out. And then I like to start taking components out of the machine because I know I'm going to have to get down to motherboard level. So I'm going to take the memory out, hard drive, anything that's attached to the motherboard that's going to stop me from getting the whole computer apart. Take the hard drive out here. This computer is very dusty on the inside, so usually I'll take a can of compressed air and blow all the air out of a laptop before I give it back to a customer. But if I know I'm going to take the entire laptop apart, I won't clean anything. I'll clean it on a as-I-go basis. So most machines, the sequence I like to do it is to get that front top plate off. This allows me to get access to the keyboard and the screen, which are two things I like to take off next. So I'm just inspecting this top plate. A lot of times these top plates, in other words, that plate above the keyboard, a lot of times it's screwed in from the bottom of the machine. So if there are screws on the underside, you want to get them off first. Now I'm trying to pull this off. There's a lot of pressure keeping it on, so I suspect that there's screws holding it in from the bottom. Now even if I'm wrong, I'm still going to unscrew these screws just to be sure. Again, rule number one in repairing laptops, if something feels like it's about to break or is going to break or you have to put excess pressure on it, then stop what you're doing because something's wrong. Now I figured since I was under the computer here, just take all the screws out from the bottom. I'm going to need to do that anyway, so I'm going to go ahead and do that. If anybody's wondering why this video is a little different than the other videos as far as me narrating it, I'm not speaking in it in real time. This is a dub over on the narration. I did this live at the shop during work hours, so I didn't have time to close everything up and make sure there was no distractions. You might see my dad walking around in the background over there. Okay, pulled the CD drive out there. I'm just going to go ahead and unscrew all the screws from the bottom, every screw that I see. Now, I'm kind of not being very careful where I'm putting the screws as I take them out, because on Toshiba laptops there are labels next to every screw hole. It tells you exactly what screw goes in each hole, so you can kind of put them all into a big pile and then put all the correct screws in at the end. Now, another reason why I'm not pulling those screws out, I'm just unscrewing them, making them loose, is because they're so dusty that the magnetic force of them is not active now, so I'm just going to turn them all over and pour all the screws out. Because the tip of my screwdriver is actually magnetic, but it wasn't pulling any of these screws up. So there's a couple screws coming out. Now again, I'm going to try to take the plate off right onto the screen there. Usually an easy way is to get it right at that hinge where I first had the screwdriver. Now just keep finessing it till you find out where you actually are able to pull it off. You don't want to force anything. The plastic breaks real easy. So just take your time and find out where the plate is going to come up the easiest. Now, I'm still suspecting there's screws holding this in. There's two screws on the back. I'm going to take them out now just in case they're holding something in, but I don't think that they are. Now, sometimes that plate is held in from the bottom with plastic clips. So if you see any clips on the bottom, you can try to pry them off from the bottom. But in this case, still no luck. So there's no screws holding it in now. There's got to be a way to just pull it off. So there we go. And it came off real easy after that. Or fairly easy. You might be able to see all the dust in that computer. It's pretty bad. Take the 2 screws off that are holding the keyboard on. They're usually tinier screws. And then the ribbon cable's fastened in there. You just got to pull the little bracket off and take the ribbon cable out. Next thing I'm doing is taking off the screen. Now you'll notice the 2 wires, not where my hands are, but on the other side of the screen there, over there. 2 black and white wire going to the wireless card. Probably would have been a better idea if I took those wires off of the wireless card before I unscrewed the screen. This way I don't have to do a balancing act with the screen as I'm taking those wires off. But okay, now there's the ribbon cable that's actually the LCD cable. It's attached to the motherboard. Pulling that off. And then the 2 antennas, which actually come off the wireless card, they go to the top of the screen through the bottom all the way to up the side and up to the top. And now the screen is free to come off. And I put that off in a safe place on the side where I'm not going to bang it. Nothing's going to happen to it. Now I just have the top and bottom plate to take off before I get to the motherboard. And the wireless card, which I'm pulling out right now. I'm playing background music in this video just to keep it a little more interesting. So this probably isn't going to be the format I do for every video, but I'll do it for now. And then I like to take any ribbon cables that are attached off, because if I'm going to be pulling the top plate of this computer off of the bottom plate to get to the motherboard, you want to make sure that no ribbon cables are connected, because if you break them, they're not fun to repair. You probably have to order a new one. Okay, so just find a spot along the edge where the laptop will come apart easily. I use my fingernail because it's not going to scratch anything. I'm just going to unplug the modem card from down there, just in case that causes a problem. And I'm just going to keep searching for the easiest corner to get apart and then go from there, kind of like how we did the plate under the key or above the keyboard under the screen. Okay, it's having a little trouble getting it apart. So just want to make sure, if you're having any trouble getting these 2 sides apart, make sure there's no screws holding them together. And once you're doubly sure of that, then you can start putting a little more pressure. But not enough where you think you're going to break something. Just enough to get the job done. And then eventually, it'll come apart. Eventually, you'll hit the right latch. Everything will come apart okay. Now, see, it wasn't coming apart. I noticed there was still 1 screw in there. So let's get that out of the picture. Try it again. And there's the other culprit. And there we go. Just be careful with those ribbon cables that they don't break. Now we have a very dusty motherboard here. First thing I'm going to do is take it outside, blow it off with some compressed air. I'll be right back. There we go, nice and clean. I'm also going to take a paintbrush here and just get any of the residual dust off. Always take the opportunity when you have these laptops apart to dust them out. I'm actually going to take the wet dry vac I have in the back there, turn it on blow, set it on to blow, and then just really give it a good blast with some air. Make sure all the dust is out of there. I like to work with clean materials, clean laptops. It's always more satisfying to get your hands all dirty and putting it all back together in the same state you took it apart. It's nicer to get it back in a cleaner state, put it all back together, give the customer a nice clean machine back. I use like a $25 Stinger wet dry vac from Home Depot. Works just fine. Been using it in the shop for, over a year now. Replace the bag every couple months. Thing's good as new. So it's a great little device. Okay, now I'm going to take a look here, see exactly what's going on. There's the power jack. I like working with these power jacks that are connected to the motherboard by wires. So there shouldn't be too much wrong with this one. We're going to take a look at it. Not really too much that could go wrong when there's two wires just sitting there right at the jack. But in this case, and I'll show you the camera a close-up of it, the pin is not really making a connection with the back contact on that jack. I'm just making sure that if I spin the pin inside that jack, just making sure that my diagnosis is correct and that the pin is just not making a real good connection. Going to take the soldering iron now, get it heated up. This way, when I'm ready to solder on there, everything will be hot. Okay, there's the jack and the tip. And it's not really in focus, but the tip goes all the way through to the end, to the back of the jack. And you can't really see it, but I'm going to basically take some solder, put it on right in the middle there, that circle in the middle, and solder it to another point of contact that I know is going into the motherboard. Just inspecting it, I want to make sure that my diagnosis is correct, and then we'll start soldering. Now that wire from the end of the jack, as you see, it goes down where the CPU fan is through to the bottom of the motherboard, and it connects to the motherboard with a plastic connector. Just want to make sure that connector's tight. That's what I did with the screwdriver just there. That connector's tight on the motherboard. So the only place it could possibly be a problem is at the end of the jack, right at that circle on the tip of the jack. So now I'm taking a file, and I'm going to scuff up the points where I'm going to be soldering on. Because if I leave it the way it is, solder might not stick that good, and it could have the same problem again. So I'm just taking a file and scuffing up the areas where I'm going to be putting solder. And then when I'm done that, I'm going to show you the points I'm going to solder. And I'll show you a close-up on the camera of what's going on. Just scuffing up that circle in the middle of the tip there. And a spot right to the edge of the tip where I'm going to be taking a piece of wire and soldering to. Just want to make sure that tip is spinning freely in there. Because if it's spinning freely, then I know that that's the problem. It seems a bit odd, actually, that tip's not making a connector with the back of that jack, but, things build up in the laptop there, dust, and the metal gets a film of something on it, and it causes it to not make a connection. So I'm just going to make a hard solder point right to it. This will all kind of make more sense as you see what I do with the solder. Right now I'm just cutting a little piece of wire that I'm going to use for the job. Going to get my helping hand. Used to be helping hands, but one of the alligator clips fell off. Helping hands are an extra set of hands, basically, that you can put stuff on while you're working with solder and wire. For some reason, this camera doesn't want to focus. I'm sorry about that. Just taking a small piece of wire that I exposed the metal on both ends. And I'm just going to take a little dab of solder, put it on both ends of that wire. There's a radio section solder I use. Make sure the soldering iron's hot enough to melt the solder. It is. So I'm just going to melt some solder on the two ends of that wire. Make sure the solder melts into the wire. And I have a little Scotch-Brite on the base of the soldering iron there that I use. And there you can see I just soldered two ends of that wire. Now I'm going to put solder on the 2 points of the jack where I'm going to be soldering the wire. Now one's going to be right in that middle circle that we saw before. Right in the middle of that circle. Now I'm being careful. I'm just soldering the middle of that circle, which is basically the back of the pin that's in the power jack. It's the back of the pin. And I just want to get inside the circle. I don't want to smear that solder all over the thing because that's just going to break again. I just want to solder from the inside of that pin, that circle. From there, one side of the wire goes, and then attach the other side of the wire to another point on the back of that jack that has a solid connection. I'll show you. Take the wire, one end, and just solder it into that middle circle that I showed you earlier. Right in the middle of the pin there. Okay, I want to put a little more solder there because it wasn't enough to actually make a good connection. Then I'm going to take that wire, mount it right in there, and I'll show you a close-up of the camera when I'm done. Then to give it a little tug, make sure that it's solid because you don't want that to come off. And that wire, was it solid? Yes, it was. And so you'll see I just soldered in the middle circle there. One end of the wire. And I'm soldering the other end of that wire to another point on the back of that jack. I'll show you in a second. And you'll see that there's solder from the middle of that jack to another point of contact on that jack, both making sure that those points are of the same connection. They're both positive. They're both red. We don't even have to mess with the ground connection, just the red connection. So basically what I did was I soldered from the end of the pin, that's on the inside of that jack, I soldered from the end of that pin to a solid point on that jack. So I know it's making a connection now. There's no looseness. It's solid. Plus you have the flexibility of that wire. So you could actually bend that pin around in the middle of the jack, and because it's a wire holding it together, you have some flexibility. It's not brittle, so it's not going to break as easy. Now it's just basically time to put everything back together. Just kind of put everything back exactly the way it was. There was a screw that was loose there for some reason. Just tighten up some screws. Fasten that tape down. Going to put a piece of electrical tape over the work that we just did. Because by putting that wire on there, that wire wasn't there before, so the laptop, when you put it all back together, because it's such a tight fit in these laptops, you can't actually create any extra lumps, balls of solder that are sitting there and expect everything to fit back exactly the way it was. So try to keep everything tight, and if you think your work that you did is going to come in contact with another piece of metal on that motherboard or in that laptop, put a piece of electrical tape or two around it just to make sure that it doesn't make a short circuit. Now, I'm just testing the connectivity, or continuity, I'm sorry, of that jack. I'm taking, you can't really see it in the camera view, I'm taking one lead of the voltmeter, putting into the middle of that jack at the tip, and making sure that it's reaching the end of the motherboard. See, I'm touching the tip there. And making sure we're getting a positive connection right through there. That way I was actually testing a ground connection there, making sure the ground is connected and making sure that tip in the middle of that jack is going to the motherboard and not touching any ground points. Just want to make sure there's no short circuits. You couldn't hear it, but voltmeters have a beep, and it'll beep when you're making a contact. So if you're touching the positive to negative, you shouldn't hear any beeps. If you hear any beeps, that's going to be a short circuit. So now I'm going to clean off the top of this plate while I have it out. Going to use the wet dry vac back there again. Blow it off. Get all the dust. I usually, again, don't dust over a piece I already dusted, or a motherboard, but I'm just doing it for the sake of the camera. It's pretty clean already. Then make sure, when that top plate goes on, make sure it fits properly over the work that you just did. You don't want it ripping apart the work that you just did. See how it's a tight fit there. You just want to make sure there's nothing really rubbing up against the work you did. Rubbing up against that wire or forcing that wire off of the point where you just soldered it. Just want to make sure everything fits. There it goes. Nice tight fit. And then you can start connecting everything back up. Making sure everything's snapping together properly. Nothing's out of place. That side, I still have a little bit of tension on that corner, but I think it's okay. Once we put the screws in, it'll push everything exactly in the right position. This little cable gives me a little bit of trouble, but just take your time with these things. You don't want to force or break anything, especially these little white connectors. They're not fun to put back together. You're going to have to get crafty with some crazy glue or really test your ingenuity with that when you break them. Okay, that's that one. It's that one. You don't even necessarily have to know what these do. Just put them back in the spots that you got them from. And tuck everything in. Attach all ribbon cables. This is a ribbon cable that has a little mini ribbon cable under it, so that's fun to put back together. One thing you don't want to do with these ribbon cables is bend them at like a sharp 90-degree angle. They will break. They may not look broken on the outside, but remember, there's strips of metal on the inside of those ribbon cables, and if you bend them, metal breaks when you bend it. It snaps. And they're not fun to put back together. So just take your time, use screwdriver, tweezers, whatever tool you need to. You take advantage of the hard plastic piece they have at the end there, and just try to handle it from that plastic piece. Don't try to bend the wire too much, or the ribbon too much. Use your fingernails, use whatever you can. This one's giving me trouble, but I'll get it in. And it's lined up. Good to go. And we have one more over there. All the ribbon cables are in place. Those two wires are in place. Let's flip it around. Screw it back together. There's my pile of screws, which isn't really a problem because, like I said, on Toshibas, they'll label their screw holes. So you have like F6, F3, F5, where those numbers, I believe, stand for millimeters. Now, don't over tighten these screws. Just tighten them so they're snug. You'll find that that's plenty tight. You never know when you have to open these again. If you over tighten every screw, it's not a fun thing. And definitely get a screwdriver that has a magnetized tip. That tip on that screwdriver, I magnetize every once in a while when it loses its charge. You just take a strong magnet and take that screwdriver and just run it over the magnet. It charges it right up. Or get a lodestone, which we recently have in the shop. I haven't used it yet, but you could use that as well. Get that CD drive in. It should fit in flush, and you should see, looking down at that hole on the top of the computer, you should see the screw hole that you have to screw into. If you don't, just make sure nothing's obstructing it, which I think something is right now. Inspect it. It's a little out of view, but I'm just basically making sure there's nothing obstructing the CD hole, the CD drive slot. And then there's usually like one or two screws that hold it in. Screw right in from the bottom, they hold the CD drive in. This one only has one screw holding it in. That's all it really needs. Hook the modem back in. Not that anybody uses dial-up anymore, but I guess we got to do it for a while. We can start putting the plates, or getting the dust out of there, if there's any residual dust, and start putting the plates and the memory back on. Really dusty. Dust off that plate. Use the old paintbrush. Get it nice and clean. Just making sure there was no screws I missed before I put this plate on. Sometimes there's screws under these plates, and if you put the plate on, you got to unscrew it all again if you find out you're missing a screw. Not in this case. Gonna get the hard drive back in there, dust it off first. This hard drive is extra dusty, so I'm going to take a can of compressed air and just blast it a little bit. Make sure all the dust is out of that hard drive. There it is. Get all the dust out of the connector there. Make sure the connection's clear. Since you have it apart, you might as well do these things. It only takes a second. And then put it in the right way, which that is not. There we go. And then you'll see on the underside of that plate, that is this. There's a piece of plastic that holds the hard drive in place. So with that one screw, you just hold out everything in place. Okay, keep the battery out. I don't like to put the battery in until I'm completely done. Let's throw the screen on now. Get all the dust out from where those hinges are. They get a little dusty under there. Just going to dust the whole screen off while I have it out. Then I'll hit it with a monitor wipe after the whole thing's done. I like to give the computers back in better condition than they gave them to me, so that's always a good policy to follow. Okay, and then take the 4 screws for the screen. Screw them in. Okay. Now you want to make sure you get that LCD connector in. Now be careful. Those LCD connections have about 30 cables, 30 small wires coming out of them. So just make sure you're a little careful when you do that. Make sure it fits in properly. You don't want to push that connector into the slot the wrong way because there's about 30 pins that you could bend. So just make sure. Put pressure on both sides evenly. And then reroute the wireless cable. Antenna, actually. Just put the wireless card in. Clean out that card and make sure clean out the connector. Oh yeah, another thing I like to do is on screen, the screws that hold the screen in. I like to take a big screwdriver and give them a little extra torque because those are the screws on laptops that come loose the fastest. So just make sure the screen's on tight. And you clean out the connector of the wireless jack, wireless port. Snap it in. Reattach the antennas. Okay, now we got that in there. Just make sure that it's clearing all the corners. You want to have that flush. You don't want any of those wires popping out because the keyboard is sitting on top of that. So you want to have that basically below the surface, those wires below the surface, so there's no lumps when you put the keyboard on. You don't want the keyboard sitting on any lumps. Everything looks like it's in place there. Time to put the keyboard back on. Dust it off. Be careful you don't damage the ribbon cable on the back of the keyboard. Dust in it. And attach the ribbon cable first. Should slide right in there. Just make sure that that's in there. Sometimes that's tricky. It could barely be in there. Like there. I wasn't 100% sure it was in, so just pull it out and reattach it. Make sure it's in there 100%. And then screw the keyboard back in. It's usually only held in by 2 small or 4 small screws. Put the plate back on. This plate is, I've talked about it before, this plate is the key. A lot of people who try to take apart laptops don't know that that plate has to come off to get the keyboard and the screen off. It's the key to getting the whole thing apart. Make sure it's all snapped back in the way it was. There's those 2 screws in the back we're going to put in. Alright, we're just about done. Roughly 40 minutes to do this repair. Okay. Let's hook that power adapter in. Power it up. It would have been wise, I've said this before, it would have been wise to test this computer before we put it entirely back together, but I was fairly certain that I knew what was wrong with it, so that repair we did now makes it so you could jiggle that adapter in the power jack. You see my hand there, it's jiggling it just to test it, and the computer's not going off. So you could jiggle the actual adapter in the power jack. You could jiggle it in there, and you're not going to lose any connection. So we know it's pretty solid in there. And since we used a wire, since we used that flexible wire, it's going to last forever. So that's how you do a power jack repair on a Toshiba laptop.